With a resolute stride, Charles emerged from the banqueting house, which had once hosted joyful gatherings. As he stepped onto the wooden scaffold, his gaze was steady and unyielding. The king took the opportunity to make a final address to his people. After stating his case, he reminded the crowd,
"I have a good cause and a gracious God on my side. I go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown, where no disturbance can be, no disturbance in the world."
The crowd held its breath as the executioner's axe gleamed in the pale sunlight, poised to strike the final blow. In a moment that stretched into eternity, the blade fell, severing the connection between the head of state and the body politic. The silence was broken by a collective groan, followed by the anguished cries of those who had once supported their king as they ran to the scaffold to collect his blood on their handkerchiefs as sacred relics, while others, stunned, reflected on the significance of the moment. The execution of King Charles marked a turning point in history, forever altering the trajectory of England and its monarchy. It ignited a firestorm that would engulf the nation, plunging it deeper into turmoil and sparking debates that would echo through the centuries. The life of a king had been sacrificed, but the consequences of his death would be felt for generations to come. A parliament had executed their king, paving the way for many more political revolutions to come. But the idea of monarchy would not be so easily extinguished by King Charles's death, and indeed his memory would remain fiercely debated, with some seeing him as a tyrant and others, such as those within the Anglican tradition, seeing him as a saint. Now you may ask, why should we be examining the execution of Charles I as part of our study of the history of America? And that's a good question. Often when we discuss the story of the Pilgrims and the generally Puritan-influenced region of New England, or examine the Virginia planter culture that gave birth to such important American figures as George Washington, we don't think about what gave birth to these distinctive ways of life that have shaped our country throughout its history. The key to understanding both, the New England Puritans and the Virginia Cavaliers, lies within the demise of King Charles, a pivotal event that marked the end of a tumultuous era characterized by profound religious and political strife, now remembered as the English Civil Wars. The English Civil Wars were a period of dramatic violence and change that occurred in the 17th century in England, Scotland, and Ireland. They were primarily a series of wars between supporters of King Charles I, known as Royalists or Cavaliers, and those who opposed him, known as parliamentarians or, more evocatively, as Roundheads. Although they largely happened far away, their impact here, and on our nation's history as a whole, was profound. The root causes of the English Civil War can be traced back to a variety of sources, and these include a bitter fight over how England would integrate the ideas of the Reformation into the Anglican Church. It also was rooted in growing tensions between different powerful people, some of whom controlled the great estates of rural England and others who were becoming rich based upon the growing wealth coming from international trade and the complex businesses that were springing up to capitalize on Europe's colonial enterprises around the world. Confusingly, many of this new class of wealthy people often blended their economic interests with their religious ideology, making it hard for us to disentangle the two so many years later. However, to put it simply, there was a lot of pent-up anger between the middle class, who were making lots of money from the changes happening due to colonialization, and the monarch and the landed aristocrats who made up the British Empire's old elite, tied to all the old traditional ways of life dating back to the medieval world of lords and peasants. The aristocrats and king didn't see it as possible that middle-class people, no matter how rich or intelligent, could rise to their level. For an example of how the aristocrats often felt about these upstarts from the middle class, we can look at Molière's Les Bourgeois Gentilshommes, which was first performed in 1670. In the story, we are introduced to Jourdain, the middle-class son of a cloth merchant. The play revolves around his desire to be elevated to the status of an aristocrat. In the first act of the play, Jourdain breaks all sorts of taboos, including wearing clothing that is above his status as a member of the middle class and pursuing aristocratic hobbies like fencing, dancing, and philosophy. His wife, who is presented as much wiser than him, is ashamed of his efforts at rising above his class and repeatedly tries to get him to embrace his God-ordained caste. As the story reaches its climax, Jourdain is exploited by numerous fallen members of the aristocracy, and eventually, in the end, subject to a complicated prank in which noblemen dressed in Ottoman clothing put him through a pretend ennoblement ceremony, demonstrating his foolishness to the world. The play, although it also takes aim at the aristocracy, practically demonstrates something important. Every society has taboos, which can often be best understood by what that culture finds humorous. Today, the idea of rising up from nothing is highly valued, but the humor of Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme demonstrates that many in the 17th century did not share our values. Molière's mocking take on rising members of the middle class offers us a tiny window into just how dismissive the aristocrats of the 17th century could be. That dismissiveness provides us with a window into why King Charles was beheaded, and perhaps even into why New England and Southeastern American cultures can feel so different, even today. As has been mentioned, the era of colonization brought an enormous series of changes to Europe's economy, including the rise of the corporation, the stock market, and even the modern forms of insurance. These economic transformations required a large, educated middle class capable of managing the complexities of the new business world. And these innovations also began to create the first middle-class people with the kinds of wealth that could challenge the descendants of the great landowners of the medieval world whose wealth had come through careful alliances and service to the king. These new middle-class businessmen had no connection to those old manorial ways of building wealth, and instead had used innovation and a deep understanding of complex mathematical and supply chain problems to build their financial positions. It is no surprise, then, that these self-made members of the newly wealthy would bristle at the snide remarks and condescending behavior of the aristocrats, who would never treat the middle class as equals, despite their success, capability, and intelligence. Without a pathway to community, the traditional respect once felt for the aristocracy began to vanish. At the same time, however, there existed, in the wake of the Protestant Reformation, a movement devoted to exploring the scriptures more carefully, of seeing beyond mere tradition, and instead trying to use the heart and the mind together to return the church back to the purity that it might have enjoyed in its earliest iteration. For these upper middle-class members of the newly empowered class, the ridicule from aristocrats, exemplified in Molière's Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme, left them in need of an alternative to the long-lasting legacy of feudalism and Catholic tradition. At heart, we humans want to be secure, to be significant, and lastly, to have a sense of belonging. Deprived of those needs, the middle class found itself drawn to Calvinism, which spoke to their intellectual rigor, their sense of destiny, and their belief that the feudal faith and tradition, which had excluded them from a place in the elite, was also a source of spiritual darkness and biblical misunderstanding. With these pieces now in place, we can begin to grasp the underlying tensions that led up to the English Civil Wars. Two factions had emerged, one with connections to the old elite, and their manorial lifestyle tended to prefer a form of Protestantism, closer to the old Catholic model of worship and hierarchy, while those interested in equalizing society and eliminating the old hierarchical traditions of the Middle Ages also tended to prefer that England's Reformation pursue a route more similar to the concepts being put into practice in Geneva, Switzerland under the guidance of John Calvin. These Calvinists sought to bring about a more radical Reformation, and in many cases align themselves with those who were interested in political reforms as well, much as Martin Luther had during the early days of the Reformation in Germany. While these tensions simmered across much of the 16th and early 17th centuries, the conflict between the monarch and Parliament finally turned violent in 1642, when King Charles I attempted to arrest 5 members of Parliament for treason. Acting with a sense of self-confidence, rooted in his feudal outlook, the king had little idea how intensely his opponents would react. Soon, There was a confrontation between the king's men and Parliament. The parliamentarians, angered by this act, began to coalesce around the leadership of Oliver Cromwell, who, rather than confining his opposition to political protest and legislation, instead developed a military capable of facing the king in the field of battle. This force, which came to be known as the New Model Army, emerged as a disciplined and capable fighting force, able to overthrow the power of the monarch. The war had a profound impact on English society. It resulted in the temporary abolition of the monarchy and the execution of King Charles I, where we started this section. Beyond that, it also led to the establishment of the Commonwealth of England, a sort of republic led by Oliver Cromwell, who served as the Lord Protector, a sort of semi-benevolent dictator for life. In the aftermath of the conflict, and even after the re-establishment of the monarchy in 1660, the role of the king would be forever diminished by the execution of Charles. And in some ways, we can see the path already being paved for the eventual rejection of monarchy here in America during our own revolution. In America, if we think about the English Civil War at all, we tend to only think about it within the context of the Puritans' role in founding the Massachusetts Bay Colony. However, the war had a far more profound impact, which helped to lay the foundation for numerous patterns that shaped early American society. The first of these impacts was the influence of religious conflict before, during, and after the war on the migration patterns of early settlers, including everyone from the Pilgrims of Massachusetts to the planters of Virginia. The prolonged religious, political, and economic conflict, which racked England in the early 17th century, prompted many individuals of both political and religious factions to seek a new life far from the continuous conflict they were facing. Secondly, those waves of immigrants and refugees tended to settle near those who shared their values, which helped to establish a division in American society between the North and South of our country. This division would eventually help play a part in our own American Civil War. Lastly, the English Civil War, with its disruptions and conflict, broke down the connections between America and England and helped to form the sentiments and grievances that eventually sparked the American Revolution and separation from the British Empire. These complex implications mean that the English Civil War, despite being largely forgotten in America today, played a massive role in the trajectory of the New World and the America that we live in today. For our first lecture, I will be making the argument that the English Civil Wars drove the migration patterns of many of the early settlers in America. The tumultuous years of the English Civil Wars not only left a lasting impact on the social fabric of England, but also set in motion a series of events that would shape the waves of immigrants and refugees from England throughout the 17th century. To better understand the conflicts that set the destinations of many of our earliest settlers, we need to first be certain that we comprehend how the Reformation, sparked by Martin Luther, spread to the English-speaking world, and how the peculiarities of how that Reformation happened shaped that conflict in England and America. The Reformation in the English-speaking world was unlike that which occurred in other countries. Controlled by Henry VIII, England opposed the Reformation at its start, leading the Pope to grant the king the title of Defender of the Faith in 1520, one for his full-throated defense of the papacy against Luther's movement. That relationship, however, fell apart quickly when the king refused to grant the king an annulment, an act that threatened his ability to pass his throne down to a son. Thus, in 1534, the Act of Supremacy was passed, which declared Henry the head of the Church of England, severing England's ties with the Roman Catholic Church and establishing Henry as an odd sort of Protestant. With this break from Rome, Henry VIII needed to create a new institution to replace the Catholic Church. The Church of England was thus formed in a highly conservative manner, retaining many of the elements of Catholicism, such as the Mass and the Episcopacy, but rejecting the authority of the Pope, who was now replaced by the king. One of the most important actions of the English Reformation was a decision that is now known as the dissolution of the monasteries. Between 1536 and 1540, the monarch shuttered the monastic houses of England, Scotland, and Ireland and confiscated their many treasured works of art as well as their endowments. This decision, purportedly motivated by religious opposition to the monastic orders, was also used as an easy way for the king to acquire vast amounts of personal wealth and the political influence that comes with it, buying friends by handing out the church's lands to anyone willing to support him. It is important to note that, unlike the Reformation in many countries, Henry VIII's motivations for joining the movement were primarily political rather than doctrinal. This left the Church of England in a confused state, with the typical parish remaining largely Catholic in doctrine and practices, and the king himself continuing to adhere to many traditional Catholic beliefs. This complex situation was filled with conflict, as many traditional Catholics felt that the king's action had been a sacrilege, while Protestants struggled to understand why the church remained essentially Roman Catholic, except in polity, left with a bizarre chimera that was neither exactly Protestant nor Catholic. Henry's daughter Elizabeth found herself surrounded by discontent. During her reign, 1550–1603, the Queen decided to split the difference by retaining many of the Catholic elements of the service, while allowing for a greater amount of theological influence from Calvinist and other Reformation thought. This became known as the Via Media, or middle way. She further established her position with a series of acts, including the Act of Supremacy in 1559, which reasserted her authority over the church and ensured her status as the supreme governor. That same year, the passage of the Act of Uniformity helped to create a distinctly Anglican liturgy with the Book of Common Prayer. The new liturgy included both Catholic and Protestant traditions and utilized an inclusive approach so that services would reflect a wide range of religious perspectives, while also seeking to prevent radicalism of either sort from seeping into the English church. It also became an easy way for her to target both traditionalist Catholics and Puritans who were united in their hatred of the Compromise Anglican Church. The Compromise laid the foundation for Anglicanism, but also provided the fuel that would eventually set off the English Civil Wars. King James I, who also served as James VI of Scotland, was born in 1566 in Edinburgh, Scotland. He was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, and inherited the throne of Scotland as an infant when his mother abdicated. In 1603, James became King of England and Ireland after Queen Elizabeth of England died without an heir, thus uniting the crowns of Scotland and England. Today, most people in America remember him for two things. Jamestown, established in 1607, was named after him, and he was responsible for the creation of the authorized version of the Bible, often called the King James Bible, in his memory. Another important event for Americans that occurred in 1607 was the departure of the Scrooby congregation, which had met in William Brewster's house, to their new home in Holland. This event, inspired by King James' decision to crack down on nonconformity, would go on to become a foundational moment in accounts of the Pilgrim's journey to America. During his reign, the religious divisions that had developed under Elizabeth managed to worsen, leading to tensions intensifying between Catholic and Calvinist leaning factions, despite his many efforts to resolve them. King James pursued a policy of tolerance and worked to retain Elizabeth's approach to keeping the Church of England at a middle ground between the various religious factions. These efforts most notably included the Hampton Court Conference and the Bible translation mentioned above. King James I was also widely known as a scholar in his times. With a deep passion for learning, he loved taking part in theological debates of the time. He was an ardent opponent of the new trend of smoking tobacco and an important patron of the arts, including for William Shakespeare. However, James's reign was by no means without controversy, and the growing tensions between him and the Puritans and Parliament, as well as ongoing tensions with the Catholic powers of Europe, would set the tone for the English Civil Wars. King James I died on March 27, 1625, in Hertfordshire, England, and was succeeded by his son, King Charles I. His legacy was a divided one, and his efforts at bringing peace among the factions of English life largely failed. In 1604, King James I convened the Hampton Court Conference between the leadership of the Church of England and influential figures from the Puritan movement. The conference addressed various issues, including religious doctrine, liturgical practices, and ecclesiastical governance. The king intended to bridge the gaps between the Puritans and the established Church of England. Following the conference, Archbishop John Whitgift passed away, causing disappointment among the Puritans. Despite Richard Bancroft, the conference did yield some advantages for the Puritans, assumed the position of under the leadership of John Reynolds. The Puritans managed to successfully convince the conference that believers could comprehend God's Word without intermediaries, a decision that led James to commission his translation of the Bible into English. This translation aimed to provide a common biblical text, acceptable to both the Church of England and the Puritans, who up to this point had been using the Geneva Bible. While not entirely successful at achieving the goal of unity, the Authorized Version's publication in 1611 played a central role in the development of the English language and literature. A less positive outcome of this conference was a growing tendency by the king to enforce religious conformity as part of his quest to reduce conflict. He issued numerous proclamations designed to suppress religious dissent and nonconformist religious opinion. These measures intended to maintain stability and prevent the spread of radical religious ideas, but often simply drove them underground, leading to the further radicalization and politicization of the Puritan movement. In addition to these moves, in 1618, King James I issued the Book of Sports, which legalized some recreational activities on Sundays after church. This declaration was intended to again create a middle way between the traditional playing of games on Sundays and the Puritans' desire for a sports-free Sabbath day. Despite his many efforts, little was resolved by James, and after the king's death, his son Charles I further exacerbated religious tensions in Britain through a series of inflammatory policies. Most importantly, his marriage to Henrietta Maria, a Catholic princess from France, raised concerns amongst Protestants in general, and Puritans in particular, who felt that he had secret aspirations to return England to Catholicism. These suspicions were further reinforced by Charles's love of elaborate rituals and belief in the God-given nature of earthly and religious hierarchy. Like his father, he sought to impose religious uniformity, further deepening divisions in his country. He wanted to enforce the use of the Book of Common Prayer, which the Puritans considered too Catholic in its form and content. Meanwhile, Puritans had gained influence outside of theology and had begun to take on an increasingly dominant role in Parliament. The conflicts that grew out of the politicization of Puritanism led to increasing tensions between the king and Parliament, eventually leading Charles to temporarily dissolve Parliament in 1626 and 1627, before he eventually dissolved it permanently in March of 1629. This decision, in which the king elected to impose personal rule, left Puritans hopeless about their future in England. Consequently, many began to plan to join their Brownist or Separatist brethren in Massachusetts, who had arrived at the Plymouth colony in 1620. In March 1629, wealthy leaders in the Puritan community were able to obtain a royal charter for the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Before the charter had been approved, a fleet of 5 ships, led by Francis Higginson, had already departed for New England, with around 300 colonists. The colony's leaders, once approval had been received, prepared to join the earlier wave, and over the course of the winter, these leaders were able to recruit a wide range of Puritan families, ensuring that the colony would be populated by a self-sufficient settlement who were largely united in ideology and prepared to establish themselves in the New World permanently. Their plans for a permanent colony were further reinforced in the following years, when King Charles attempted to introduce a revised version of the Book of Common Prayer in Scotland in 1637, leading to the outbreak of the Bishops' Wars. These conflicts exacerbated the broader tensions between Charles I and Parliament. In particular, because Puritans had become a fairly major voice in society and their higher levels of education left them, by and large, superior communicators. What emerged from these conflicts was a growing alignment between the political and religious opponents of Charles I's policies. Eventually, Oliver Cromwell, a Puritan and a parliamentarian emerged as a central figure in the struggle culminating in the defeat of the Royalists and Charles's capture. Ultimately, Charles I's strained relationship with Parliament, along with his resistance to Puritan demands for religious reforms, led to his defeat, arrest, and eventual execution, leading to a period known as the Interregnum, in which Cromwell ruled as a dictator. With the execution of the king, a new wave of refugees arrived in America, mostly in Virginia, where, like their Puritan forebears, they sought shelter from a political climate that no longer felt safe. One of the most notable examples of this flight to Virginia was the Royalist Colonel Henry Norwood, who had been part of a secretive group at the time of the execution of King Charles, possibly as part of a plan to rescue him. Regardless of his role, Norwood and his team decided to flee the country and head for the New World, specifically to the Virginia colony. Along with his friends, Norwood traveled with over 100 others seeking to start over in America. Setting sail on September 23, 1649, aboard the Virginia Merchant, Norwood and the other escapees ended up facing a journey as risky as their rumored plan to save the king. He wrote,
"This unparalleled butchery, that is to say, the execution of Charles I, made use cast away the scabbard of our swords with both hands, that the sad prospect of affairs in this juncture gave such a damp to all the royal party, that a very considerable number of nobility, clergy, and a very considerable number of nobility gentry so circumstanced did fly from their native country, as from a place infected with the plague."
As they traversed the Atlantic, Norwood wrote down a remarkable account of seeing the playful antics of dolphins, survived a shipwreck that nearly killed him, and even found himself in such a dire situation that some of his compatriots resorted to cannibalism. On January 4, 1650, after months of uncertainty, the star-crossed refugees finally made landfall in Maryland, where the captain simply deposited the supporters of the king and departed, leaving them defeated and marooned on an unfamiliar shore. For over a week, Norwood and the other refugees endured a challenging existence, relying on what resources they could scavenge, including, reportedly, the bodies of their fellow cavaliers. The situation improved dramatically when the marooned men met some kindly Native Americans who provided assistance and brought them back to their village. Finally able to recover from the long voyage and long of food and water, Norwood was able to communicate some basic information with his rescuers, discovering that they were not very far. In fact, from their intended destination of Virginia, called in the local language, Accomac. Guided by Jenkin Price, a local planter, Norwood finally set off on the last leg of his epic escape from England, when he embarked on a remarkable odyssey through the wilderness and across the Chesapeake Bay to Ludlow's plantation. Once there, Norwood was able to borrow a horse, which he rode to Jamestown, and from there he finally made it to his destination, Green Spring Plantation, the residence of Sir William Berkeley, the governor of the colony and a Royalist sympathizer, half a year after his departure. The English Civil Wars had a profound impact on the migration patterns of early settlers who were seeking refuge in the New World during the complex aftermath of the Reformation, as it spread to England as part of Henry VIII's efforts at ensuring a male heir. Although several successive monarchs struggled to unite the divided Church of England, each effort was only met with growing discontent and further polarization. Both King James and his son, Charles, managed to alienate and terrify Puritans and separatists alike, leading them to flee first to Holland and then in several waves, including both the Mayflower Pilgrims and the Puritans of the Winthrop fleet, to the New World. Eventually, the Puritan and Parliamentarian alliance was successful, and the king was executed, leading many Royalists, such as Henry Norwood, to follow the Puritans to the New World, in the hopes of establishing a new life, free from the dominance of their religious and political enemies. These stories serve as a testament to the lengths people were willing to go to and the hardships that many early Americans endured in search of religious freedom, political stability, and a better future